the Daoland healthcare program. As you know, we have every week, we have another video, we talk about a topic related to Chinese medicine, Kung Fu, Taoism, and so on and so on. We do a similar kind of thing on our Friday evening streams, and we have a practice class on Wednesday morning. This is of course Central European time. When you are from the Americas, that is a little bit of a time difference somewhere between 6 and 8 hours, I believe. And if you are in Asia, of course, there's also a time difference, which is very similar, but in the other side of the time. So when it is afternoon in the United States, it is evening in Europe, and it is morning in, say, China.
At the moment, when we go through a topic, I usually give you a little indication of what we want to talk about this time also, because this time we are going to talk about death. Now, normal death. Is death actually normal? We are going to try to investigate this, and we go try to look behind the lack of logic of why death should be normal.
It seems that the death of living beings is left a little bit to chance, and that living beings do not seem to be able to also avoid this inertia problem, namely that they are on a habitual track of living. They follow a particular kind of trajectory, but at a certain point inertia creeps in. There's going to be decay of the different structures of the body, friction is being created, people become less efficient in the way how they eat and drink and how they digest things to create new life in themselves, and as a result of that gradually disease creeps in, aging creeps in, wrinkles come about, and all the other things through which people actually give up and think like, well, yeah, death is normal, everybody's dying. So you see it everywhere, and well, just let it happen, it's okay. And for this we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Chinese medicine, the continuous revival and renewal of the body is seen as a function of the kidney jing. And the kidney jing is a force which in Daoland is being described as something that we do, it's not something that we have. So unfortunately in modern TCM it is seen as a scientified way as something that is inside us, like a substance which gives us the ability to do something for a while, and at a certain point it becomes finished. So it means there's a finite amount inside you, and as a result of that you gradually, well, terminate. That's the right, I suppose. When you get into that kind of system, you think about that Chinese medicine part, you see that this jing as being defined in Daoland as something that you do is also something that you then can control, you can exercise it, and as a result of that you can improve on it, and as a result that you can delay the aging process, and this is why they say, for instance, things like Qigong and Daoland, that it gradually delays the onset of death. Of course, when you're not dying, it's very difficult to measure how much you are being delayed with death, but at the moment when you turn about 150 or something, you can definitely say you're being successful in this practice. And the idea within the Taoist theories and Chinese theories from the past is that a good immortal will probably make about 1,000 years before his full transformation to a completely conscious immortal or god or something like this will be completed. So until that time there are different stages that a person might be going through as a result of the non-dying process, but he means to continuously then control him or herself to make sure that they will not fall apart and they do not succumb to the lack of qing. And it means that you have to build the tools within yourself to make sure that the qing is not being depleted. That means that you do not become weak, and then you see that your greatest enemy is basically tiredness, disease, and so on and so on. The things that can happen to you as an external force that are working on you, but that by natural inertia, when the qing is being maintained properly, you would actually live forever. So that means that immortality practice in effect uses the principles of inertia and actually tries to avoid the principles of decay that is also happening at the same time, namely that movable systems at a certain point degrade in quality, and as a result of that, because they have a beginning, also have an ending. And that means that the inertia is not really there, and you see it described in the theories of the Buddha in the Lotus Sutra, for instance, where it is being said that the Buddha nature is something that is created at a certain point as a result of the accumulation of merit, and at the moment when the merit is finished, then the Buddha nature is being finished also, and the Buddha then at that moment has to be reborn again and has to go through this whole cycle again and then work itself up to the same kind of enlightenment as before. We don't know anything about that, about Taoism and immortality. There is no talk about that as far as I know, but if it is there, then please show me. If you can show it to me, it would be really great. One of the main things that we can take away from this is that the body system, when it ages, becomes less efficient and less good in nourishing itself and making sure that the awareness process is going on. So that means that we are immortal, but we need a nourishment process to make sure that it's going, and we need a repair process. And the repair process is actually part of the functions of the kidney Jing. They have to do that. You have to do that, and that Jing, in that sense, is a part of being body, but it's also a part of being conscious. And then we can see that this whole concept of life and inertia and so on seems to hinge on two parts. One, it is inertia. Is there inertia? The systems in nature are primarily inertial, or are they self-propellant? Because at the moment when they're self-propellant, they can fix themselves and they can repair themselves and they can make sure that they keep on growing and flowering and so on and develop. And that is in Neidan is seen as a four-step process, namely the development of Jing, the development of Qi, and the development of Shen, and then integrate them in a whole, with as a whole, that the completion of this process allows you to have the tool to live forever. You see in modern theory that they follow basically the yogic theory that you have to transcend from the coarse to the fine. So then they see the Jing as the lowest level, and the Qi as a better level, and the Shen as a higher level, and then they transcend. And that is not, in essence, a Taoist principle, although I'm quite sure there's a lot of Taoists who would like to think about it like that in this time, even in China itself, although all the classics seems to deny that pathway of thinking. We have to ask ourselves in many ways, like, what is death in fact? The moment we can think about what is death, we have to accept the question as a consequence that if death is permanent, or if it is reversible. That means if it is irreversible or is it reversible. If death is irreversible, that means that at the moment when you die, well, you cannot come back to life anymore. So zombies, then in that sense, would actually be like a little bit of a strange thing to exist. And I get the question very frequently from my daughter's puppy.
Puppy, are zombies real?
What do I actually have to answer on a question like that? Some people seem to be living like zombies because they work all the time on this default position of inertial development.
What we see is that in our body there is a continuous process of necrosis going on. That means that the different cells of our body die. And when you talk about zombies, you talk about people who are alive but where the necrosis has taken over most of the body, and that as a result of that there is no real living thing inside, but it's still being propelled forward. And it means that the zombie actually, in a sense of self-propellantness, is maybe superior to a living creature. That will be like a weird thought that you will never see in movies, I hope.
Because that would make zombies like a preferable state of existence.
When you look at that, you can see that death in a way is a form of systemic necrosis. That means that the whole system dies, and as the whole system dies, in effect there is nothing left. In that sense, I don't like to be cremated when I die, although cremation is seen as very common because there's not enough place for all the dead people in the earth. But the thing is that at the moment when you cremate, At that moment you basically also take away part of the nourishment cycle of the rest of nature away. That means that normally when necrosis takes place, in the necrosis process, new beings come about and they eat your body and they take parts of your body back into nature as a whole, and as a result of that you serve as food for other creatures. That is in itself is a noble part of the natural dying process, that if you have to die, at least you serve the purpose of feeding other creatures. At the moment when you go cremate yourself, it is based on the idea that something better will come from you if you would basically steal yourself away from nature and then transform yourself. In the Wu-Xing theory of Chinese medicine, Taoist theory, you can basically say if you are like wood, that means you are life, you are wind, you are plant life, and you are animal life, and so on and so on. Then at the moment when you die, you basically, because of the living process, you burn yourself, and at the moment when you're burned, there's only ashes left, and this ash then piles up with all the other living dead people, formerly living, now dead people, and you compound and make the soil of the earth, and as a result of that it compounds and it becomes gold. That means that ore is being produced, and this ore then has to be taken out, and that is then seen as a improvement which allows a new cycle to start and bring life out again. If you look at it within a natural process, that would actually happen when life has burned you and you go back into the earth. At the moment when you burn yourself twice, that means you have been burned already because of your life being terminated, and then you burn yourself in a pile of fire, you steal away life from other creatures. And it's a little bit similar like when the emperors in the past, they would bury themselves and they would take their horses and their wives with them, maybe some slaves also. Yeah, so they would also terminate their lives.
To enhance the meaningfulness of their own death. That is, of course, crazy.
So cremation is basically off the charts. You can't do that. You're stealing yourself away from nature as a whole, so you have to be buried. And that might very well mean, because of lack of space, that you have to be buried all together, and we throw people in a big pit. Doesn't really matter. In the end, we're all going to be food for other living creatures. So
what the heck?
So when you look at physical death, that is one thing. And that's a process of necrosis, and how you resolve that by cremating or burying. That is, of course, there's other ways, by the way, also. But at that moment, you can say, okay, then there is also the death of the person. So when is death really death? Is death the death of the body? That means the necrosis process. Or is death the death of the person? And at the moment when you are dying, you have to also recognize that during life your personhood is not really very stable something. I don't know if you ever get emotional, or when you ever had a disease through which you become irritable or anything like that. You can see that your personhood is not very permanent, and it is changeable all the time, and we very often change. When our life circumstances change, we become different kind of people. We are different from when we are single, from when we are married or living together with somebody, or we are divorced, or we have kids, or we have no kids. All these kind of things, they changes all the time, and there's famous stories about people who were guardians in concentration camps, torturing people, but at home they were great parents and a great wife, and they were great kids for their parents, taking good care of them. So the circumstances very often determine who and what we are. And there is likewise in the Iraq war, there was the scandals about these American soldiers who were sexually abusing and torturing Islamic prisoners, insulting them in a particular way of showing them in pictures. These processes are still going on, and we know that in the recent past there were some highly suspect legal judgments about these kind of things to free these people from the crimes that they committed. These same people, they were seen by their environment as being good people. It's just that the circumstances that created a different part of them which made them do really bad things. And maybe you have done things in the past that you were not very proud of afterwards, but from which you said, like, you know, this was just circumstantial, and you know, it just happened. That means that your essence of being you, is not really essential. As I already revealed before, the Daoland process is seen as a process of building continuance inside ourselves, so that after death our being as a human being, physically or as a behavioral existence, is being continuated in one form or another. And there are of course a lot of questions about it, and the method that we use are very varied. You can say that for living creatures within Chinese medicine, and now I give you an outline of how Chinese medicine works. It's not what you learn in all the textbooks, but this is how Chinese medicine was outlined from the beginning, and actually till to the current day should normally wise function. And that is also what we of course profess in our Daoland program. You see that Chinese medicine is basically divided in two parts. One is the Daoland part and one is the Daoland part. And the Daoland part is what you do to yourself, and the Daoland part is what is being done to you. So at the moment when you become really very sick, you go to a therapist and they give you acupuncture or massage or herbs or food, diet therapy. Diet therapy of course is the top because you influence yourself with it every day. Or they give you herbs, so for which you need more specialized knowledge about disease, or acupuncture, or they give you massage or something like this. Then at that moment they can give you exercises even, and then they influence you by giving you exercises. Then you go through a process where an external force is being applied to you, and then basically the principles of inertia is being confirmed. At the moment you look at the Daoland part, you actually try to become self-propellant, and through the habit of exercise, you through Tai Chi Chuan, Qigong, Daoyin, Tuna, all kind of other things, yoga of course also is an essential part of that, and through all this kind of practices you are trying to develop a control where you are continuously monitoring and changing yourself to make sure that you become self-propellant, and as a result of that continuously anticipate on the changes that might happen, and as a result of which you might eventually demise. Yeah, that is the right word. You try to avoid of course demising as a result of that, and you try to avoid necrosis, and you try to avoid physical death as well as personality death, through whatever means possible. And that is an organic process, and nobody can say like, okay, this is what you have to do and then you can avoid it. At the moment when you have to do a particular kind of practice and then they say like, as a result of that you will not die, that is of course silly, because that is inertia being done in a very default and blindfolded way. So that means there is no anticipation to the actual process. That is why in the Daoland program we have so many different kind of practices, because once you have become experienced enough and you have become knowledgeable enough that you can apply all these kind of things, you know exactly when to apply which part, in the hope that you can avoid this whole process of dying.
It's so amazing if we could.
So in general we can say that in Chinese medicine Daoland is seen as superior to Daoland, because of all kinds of circumstances. The Daoland part is a necessary part, because as a Daoland student it is a good idea to practice Daoland practices, because at the moment when you do so you are actually on the tail end of humanity, and you learn a lot about the processes at the root of life, and where the inertia actually creeps in, and where it causes disease and so on and so on, so that you can recognize for yourself how to avoid it. And it is where also the theory of Chinese medicine as it is, irrespective of its interpretations by Westerners and Western spirituality or chemistry or anything like that, is in many ways superior, because it is actually the language and the practice of becoming an immortal, and as a result of that you need to do that in the original settings to be able to use it as such a tool. Because all the Western scientific theories, they go into another direction. They are looking for a particular chemical which can avoid, for instance, the breakdown of telomerase, or they look for a particular kind of chemical that is going to make sure that the mitochondria get nourished enough and continuous by a particular kind of other chemical, so that it can produce ATP in your cells, and so on and so on. So there's always this kind of little kind of mechanical things which in itself also eventually becomes so complicated at a certain point. It is all about me not dying, but it's not about life not dying. And this is where it's a big difference between Chinese medicine and Western medicine. So what do you think? You think people can become self-motivational or self-motivated so that they can avoid death? Let me know in below what is your reaction on that and what you think about that. If you feel like, you know, this guy is onto something, you're welcome, of course, to participate in our program. And I don't want to make advertisement for our program per se, but there are a lot of tools in there through which you eventually might have luck, and I might have luck. We all might have luck, but we have to, you know, study it. I have been studying now this topic for over 30 years, more, you know, directed, and I developed the Daoland program on the basis of what I think all the tools that are required to eventually be able to overcome this natural inertia, to become self-propellant, because this is basically how to define not dying, and we have to see if that is going to work. It will be nice if we all together can prove that we can at least delay our lives, or our deaths anyway, for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 or 1,000 years. Our children are being proposed to be able to live under 20 years because of the development of modern medicine and science, but the reality is that life also has become much more dangerous because there's all kind of oncoming death threats coming to us. There's of course now at this moment this COVID thing. There's other diseases which are there, which are still on the rise because of the way how our society has become more complicated and is causing these new kind of diseases. There is of course the threat of war in many countries, civil war. The wars between countries are much less, but on the other hand there is this now growing fear and discussion about a third world war between China and the West, or at least the United States. And that would mean that the whole West of course is going to be involved, and all the non-West too. So it is going to be quite unavoidable about what's going to happen. There is this continuous stupidity conflicts between religious fanatics on all sides, and even the ones who are in denial of religion, they are fanatic about other people's religion. It is sometimes scary. And then there's of course the environmental thing, of which we don't know exactly how disastrous it's going to be. There's going to be for sure much less oxygen in the world because it's all going to be tied up in thermodynamic processes which are going to be harmful to our lungs, and through which of course we have to learn new ways of breathing to be able to deal with it. And I just had a discussion with that with my students, that the methods that we use in the breath yoga are actually very suitable to also deal with environmental pollution, because it's a slower and more efficient way of breathing than what people usually do, because people usually like to breathe more so they feel more strong and stuff like this. And it's the same mentality that causes environmental pollution. It is very consumer driven and very naive about the biology of our human being. Let me know what you think about it. Then there's the last part that we still need to deal about, because of course death is for many people very unavoidable, and how do you deal with that? Almost every week we hear now every week about death toll because of COVID and so on. If you have been a victim in your family and somebody died there, or is at the verge of dying, or because of any other disease, whether it is cancer or diabetes, or you cannot mention whatever kind of horrible diseases there are which causes people to die, then of course that's a very sad thing. And how do you deal with that? My advice would be normally to deal with it by making sure that you have in your house a fixed place where you can put a photo of anybody going to die and who or has just been dying, and make sure that every day you spend 15 to 30 minutes just being there and communicating with that person, in the sense of reminiscing that person, your relationship with that person, what you learned from that person, so that you can express yourself gratitude towards the role that that person had in life, And instead of grieving about what you're going to miss, be grateful for the things that you got from that person. And this way you integrate that person in your daily life as a memory and as a part of your inner conversation, which is shaping your personality. And you create a sort of open-mindedness basically about death and change and transformation, through which you don't need to suffer from it. It is also very important at the moment when somebody dies, you immediately start grieving. Make sure you take your time to cry. You don't need to cry, until you die. Like in Chinese culture before, you were supposed to mourn about especially your father when he would die, and then as a man you would have to mourn for 3 years, and you would have to spend the whole family fortune basically for the mourning, so that you would start from scratch with your family, and whole families were ruined just because of trying to be proper children and mourn in the right way, if the family was just not right enough for that. So that is also not the right way. When somebody dies, that's bad enough. If it is going to cost you emotionally or physically or materially, that is of course not exactly the purpose of dying. If somebody dies and they take a lot of things with them, that's selfishness. If you grieve about somebody, it is very sad to say, but that is because you have been doing things not in the right way. This is a saying of Zhuangzi. In Zhuangzi stories, it says that he was being blamed by a student because he was singing and drinking at the deathbed of his wife after she died, and he says like, well, I have always been good to her, I've always given her what she needed, and so I have nothing more left to give, and at the moment when she is dead, then maybe she has an easier life than this life, so I can only be happy for her. And that is the main important ingredient of accepting death. At the moment when you accept death, then don't grieve about it. You can grieve about it in a formal way, so that you make sure that you spend your time integrating that person, but be at the same time happy about that person having gone to another form of existence. And no matter what you think about how things should be done, somebody who dies should be remembered in a positive sense and not in a negative sense. It doesn't help you, and in case there is something like an afterlife, then that person in that afterlife is going to look back and say, oh, I'm so guilty about having died, because that person is having so much pain for missing me, and now they feel so lonely without me, and maybe they become then a hungry ghost and they start harassing you all the time, and that is also not good. And I'm not sure if I could say in a movie like this that hungry ghosts are a real thing, or if I even should say something like this, but you can imagine if these things are real, then that is not a good situation. So make sure that at the moment when somebody is going to die in your life, you prepare for that. Make sure you have a good grieving place, you have in your agenda daily time to grieve, and to make sure that that person has a meaningful existence in you and in your life after its death. And then at that moment you have been allowing that person to die with honor, and you have allowed that person to have an honorable place in your life, so it contributes to your quality as a being, and as a result that you become a better person. So I hope this video was very nice for you. If you have any other remarks than the ones that I asked you for, then also you can put them below, of course. If you would like to support the channel one way or the other, then go to our Patreon page. At the end of the video you will see the reference to it, or also maybe below in the YouTube registry you can find some information probably. Then when you go there, make sure you join also, if you can, one of the other programs, and we become close friends, and we can have this kind of silly discussions every day. I hope you had a nice time in this session, and I hope you enjoyed my background. I liked it very much, that's why I took it for today. And I thought like, this is really amazing today, because everything is so much flourishing. If I do this in the winter, it will just look sad.
There's another one. You also do another one then. Yeah.
How long do I stand there?